Hi, it's Debbie here, and today I'm sharing an old technique, but one I still return to time and time again as it produces such lovely results. Heat emboss resist is where you stamp a design and heat set an embossing powder over the top. This creates a smooth, slick surface which will resist watercolours or inks added over the top. I particularly like using this technique with a lovely background stamp, and the one I'm using today is the Flourish background from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to watercolour over the heat emboss design, and so I picked a watercolour card to use, Archer's Hot Press watercolour card. Hot press card has a smoother surface than cold press card, which is more textured, and this will mean that I will get a better stamped impression of the delicate pattern on this stamp on the smooth hot press card. I cut the watercolour card to be 6 inches square and placed it in the MISTI. I lined up the background stamp on top and then closed the door of the MISTI to pick up the stamp. I treated the card with an anti-static powder bag, and this will help prevent embossing powder randomly sticking everywhere. I stamped the background several times in Simon Says Stamp clear embossing ink to ensure I had a good impression. Stamping in a clear ink like this means that you can't see if you've covered everywhere sufficiently, and so I like to stamp at least a couple of times to make sure. I then sprinkled Simon Says Stamp white embossing powder over the stamped impression, making sure to cover everywhere fully, and then I heat set with a preheated heat tool until the powder melted and smoothed over. I'm going to be using a lot of water on this card, and so I attached it to a board with painter's tape to help prevent the card from warping. To start, I covered the whole card with a layer of water using a broad flat brush. The layer of water will help any paint I add to flow and puddle between the embossed design, and that is one of the things I love about adding the paint over the embossing. The way you get the darker areas where pigment has puddled around the design, and then highlight areas where there's more water. Personally, I like the contrast between the lights and shades, and I feel it adds interest and movement. The paints I'm using today are from Daniel Smith. In the main I use Cascade Green, a lovely complex green which separates as it dries into areas of blues, greens and browns. To emphasise the blues more, I also bought in PHTHALO Turquoise. I splattered liberally with Perfect Pearl solution at times to add shimmer, and I also spritz with more water to get things flowing more. I like to work in layers, so having dried the first layer, I then came back in with a second layer and eventually a third layer. With these layers I use less water, and so you get more concentrated colour and the hard lines as the paints dry. This also adds more texture and interest. The heat embossing does resist some of the paint, but equally when adding more concentrated colour, you can find that paint settles on top of the embossing. You can rub with a soft cloth, but I find an effective method is to take a scrap piece of card, fold it a couple of times so that it's nice and sturdy, and then wrap a baby wipe around it. Dragging the white covered edge of the card over the painted surface should hit just the raised embossed areas and wipe the paint away. Another way to bring back some of the white embossing is to dampen the embossed areas with a small paintbrush and then mop up any of the paint with a paper towel. Personally, in the same way that I like highlights and shade areas in the painting, I also like how the embossing comes and goes depending on how much paint is covering over the top. However, if this style isn't for you, then you can always create a pretty watercoloured panel and then white heat emboss over the top, and this way you will have a pristine white embossed pattern. I finished off this panel with a good splatter of more of the Perfect Pearl solution, white gouache and some of the leftover paints I'd used. I really like how these multi-layered backgrounds come together. You can see the pattern, but it comes and goes with the painted layers and splatter. I removed the painter's tape, and now I'm missing a bit of video footage as I turned the camera off as the doorbell went and then forgot to press go again when I came back to my desk. While the camera was off, I trimmed the background panel down to be just slightly smaller than an A2 card, and then played around with adding vellum over the top to create a spot for a sentiment. I sewed the vellum in place with silver thread, and you can perhaps just see here that I tore the edges of the vellum strip. I did this by taking a long strip and then ripping the one edge and repeating on the other edge before I went to do the sewing. Moving on, and the vellum now creates the perfect spot for my die cut sentiment. I die cut the Thinking of You dies from Simon Says Stamp from Bazzill Marshmallow card. I find this soft white a good match for the embossing rather than a bright white. I use Gina Connect glue to add the sentiment to the vellum, and I find it handy to dab off excess glue on a scrap piece of card before adding it to the vellum. This way you are less likely to get excess glue squidging out of the sides. I used a T-square ruler to make sure I had the first line on straight, and then continued to add the rest of the die cuts. To embellish this simple card a little, I pulled out the outline clustered leaves die. This has to rank up there with one of my all-time favourite dies. I die cut the die from more Bazzill Marshmallow card, and then trimmed a couple of pieces away from the main sprig to add under my sentiment vellum panel. I added a little Gina Connect glue to the end of the branch, and then tucked it under the vellum. This will help to keep the leaves in place, but I also added a few of the solid die cut leaves with foam adhesive, and I made sure to attach these leaves so that they help to adhere the sprigs in place. I scored and folded an A2 card base from Bazzill Marshmallow card, and then attached the panel with foam adhesive. As a final embellishment, I sprinkled around a few diamonds in the opalescent colourway from Little Things from Lucy's cards, and kept them in place with Gina Connect glue. And that completes this Heat Emboss Resist watercolour background. I'll leave links in the YouTube description below to the products that I've used today, as well as a link to the coordinating blog post over at limedoodledesign.com. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you've enjoyed this tutorial, I'd be delighted if you subscribe to this channel. Also, if you'd like to get notified when a new video is out, don't forget to hit the bell button next to the subscribe button too. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.